Hey there tonight. I invite you to drift backward. Not just in time, but through texture, through velvet curtains, mosaic shadows, and sandalwood-scented air. Close your eyes now. Imagine candlelight dancing behind carved wooden screens, and voices whispering like silk drawn across skin. This isn't a tale of conquest or cannon fire. Tonight, we go somewhere more hidden, into the harem, but not the myth. Not the lurid fantasies woven by foreign travelers with wide eyes and narrow minds. No, we'll trace the truth. Through law, power, scent, ritual, and love, not always tender, not always fair, but always layered. Welcome to the Topkapı Palace. It is the 16th century. The empire is breathing at its peak. Its lungs stretch from Hungary to Mecca. Its pulse felt in call to prayer, horse, hooves, and courtly secrets. And at the heart of this vast dominion sits the harem, a word that means forbidden, but not in the way you think. You see, in the Ottoman world, the harem wasn't just a pleasure dome. It was a school, a sanctuary, a trap, a throne room made of cushions and curtains, where empires tilted depending on who captured the sultan's gaze and held it. The women here weren't lounging in boredom, plucking lutes while waiting for scented baths. They were strategists, sometimes survivors, occasionally poets. Always watched, let's slow our steps. Sandals on polished marble, past fountains that whisper even now, past fig trees bowed with fruit, past eunuchs in black and crimson uniforms, silent as the shadows they drift between. The harem wasn't just a room, it was an entire wing. Dozens of chambers, gardens, baths, schools, dormitories, and walls. High ones, thick walls that didn't just keep women in. They kept stories in, and tonight, we step beyond them. But not loudly, not with torch or trumpet. Gently, as if you too are a newcomer, freshly arrived, newly adorned in silks, and unsure of what tomorrow holds. Maybe you are. Maybe, in this story, you are a young girl from Circassia, or Crimea, or the Balkans, taken, traded, or sent by family ambition. Your hair's washed with rosewater. Your hands are softened with olive oil. Your future now belongs to imperial etiquette and endless waiting. You are now part of the harem of the Sultan. Do you speak Turkish? Not yet, but you will. You'll also learn Arabic for prayers, Persian for poetry. You'll be taught to read more than many free women beyond these walls. You'll study court music, needlework, philosophy, and manners. Your instructor's older concubines, who learned the hard way what it means to serve and to survive. This is not your home, but it will be. The other girls are both your sisters and your rivals. Their smiles are warm but measured. Every compliment might carry a barb. Every giggle could be a warning, because here, beauty is currency. Favor is dangerous, and the path to power is narrow, but paved in silk. Each girl hopes for the same thing, to be chosen. Not just once, but again. Not just to lie beside the Sultan, but to become something greater. A mother. Let's pause. That word mother, in the harem, it meant everything. The valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was the most powerful woman in the empire. She ruled over the harem with absolute authority. Even the Sultan bowed to her wishes in some matters. She had her own staff, her own court, her own seal. So for the young women behind these walls, becoming a mother meant more than emotion. It meant elevation, a secure future, influence, and maybe, just maybe, love. But love here was a fragile thing. You see, the Sultan had many concubines. Some he visited once, some he returned to. Very few captured his lasting attention. Fewer still bore him children. Each woman waited, not with flowers, but with calculation. The call could come at any hour when the Sultan desired you. It was the Kisler Akosk, the chief black eunuch, who would bring the message. No words, just a nod or a gesture. You'd be bathed, perfumed, dressed in your best kaftan. A necklace of amber and prayer hung gently around your throat. You'd walk the corridor that curved like a question mark through the palace, lanterns flickering along the walls, your slippers making no sound. Were you excited, terrified, proud? Tonight, he wants you. But what then? The Ottoman Sultan did not marry in the Western sense. His concubines were not wives, and yet, their roles were defined by ritual, tradition, and deeply intimate politics. He might lie beside you once, and never again. Or he might whisper your name every night for a season, or a year, or forever. He might father your child, and if he did, everything changed. You would be elevated, separated from the rest. You were now, as Odelic, a favorite, a mother of the heir of potential Haseki Sultan, the chief consort. You might have rooms of your own, servants, jewels, letters written in your name. You might whisper to the Sultan after the lamps are blown out, not just words of affection, but warnings, advice, names to trust or avoid. This was not just seduction, it was influence, but there were rules. Ottoman law forbade the Sultan from having more children with the same woman after her first son was born. Why? To prevent dynastic factions. To stop one woman from becoming too powerful. But not every Sultan obeyed. One did. And she changed everything. Her name was Harem. You'll hear more of her, but not yet. Let's turn back to the harem halls. Imagine the mornings. The air still cool with dew. Slippers padding across tiles. The smell of cardamom tea and almonds wafting through lattice windows. Girls practicing oud songs. Old women humming while weaving sashes from gold thread. A scribe teaching verses of Rumi to a girl who blushes when the word love is recited. There is laughter. Yes, there is peace. But always, always, a hush. Beneath it all, the hush of watching, of waiting, of listening through doors. Intimacy here wasn't private. It was public in whispers. If the Sultan favored you, everyone knew. If he ignored you, they pitied you, or smiled too sweetly. Jealousy wore perfume and smiled politely. But let's not make it crueler than it was. There were friendships here, two deep ones. Sisters not by blood, but by experience. Women who braided each other's hair and shared secrets after the lamps were dimmed. Bonds formed not from trust alone, but necessity. And then, there were the eunuchs, the silent stewards of the harem. Castrated as boys, many were taken from Africa, trained with absolute discipline, and sworn to loyalty beyond reproach. They moved like smoke. They knew everything, and told nothing. To the outside world they were both feared and mocked. But, inside the palace, they were power brokers, guardians, interpreters at times. They were confidants, the only men allowed into the women's world. Imagine being one, living in between, not a woman, not a man, and yet knowing more than either. Tonight, as sleep begins to brush your thoughts, picture this. You are lying on a cushion in a chamber hung with pale blue silks. A breeze lifts the curtains. You can hear a fountain, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. The call to prayer drifts faintly from the distant courtyard. Someone is whispering nearby, a prayer or a poem. And you know that behind these walls, behind every veil, behind every eyelash lowered or smile offered, is a world deeper than the tiles beneath your feet. Tomorrow, we'll follow those footsteps. We'll hear the poetry shared between lovers who could never speak in daylight. We'll explore the laws that governed touch, the rituals before each encounter, and the myths that blurred pleasure with power. But for now, rest. The walls of Topkapı hold many stories, and we've only just begun to listen. The fountain still murmurs outside your window. You are not sure whether you've slept or only drifted. In this palace, dreams and waking seem to flow into each other, like rosewater poured into milk. Nothing stands firm, everything floats. The soft creak of a wooden door. The flicker of lamplight behind a screen. Morning, not quite, just the in-between. The harem lives here in half-light and half-truths. Someone passes in the corridor. You hear the faint rustle of a silk robe. No one speaks at this hour, but messages move, not in words, in glances, in gifts, in scented letters folded into slippers. You've been here long enough now to understand some of the rules. Not all. No one understands all. Even the valid sultan, the mother, who sits like the moon, above all the women here, watches her words. Even she listens through walls. And now, we turn to the rituals. Those quiet preparations that softened power into something tender. Or at least pretended to. No meeting with the Sultan was casual. Before a concubine could be summoned, she would be prepared like a sacred offering. The Kalfas, the older women, would wash her hair with henna and musk, her skin scrubbed with olive oil, polished with amber dust, and rinsed with rosewater until it glowed. She would be dressed, but not in flamboyant costume. The Ottomans were subtle. A pale kaftan threaded with silver, a sash embroidered with tulip motifs, the empire's flower of passion and power. Around her wrist, perhaps a bracelet carved with a verse from Hafiz. Then came the scent, perfume. To the Ottomans, was not decoration, it was memory. A language older than speech. The concubines wore different oils, based on their moods. Jasmine for hope, sandalwood for longing, clove for courage. Some layered perfumes and secret recipes, known only to them. A signature, a whisper of identity, in a place where names were often left behind. Because yes, that's another truth. You were renamed when you arrived. Whatever your parents once called you, it faded like smoke. Here, you became someone new. A name chosen by the Hezinedar, Yusta, the mistress of the household. Something elegant, symbolic. Names like Aesel, Moonstream, Nilüfer, Waterlily, Farid, the unique. And perhaps you accepted it easily, or perhaps you whispered your birth name into your pillow each night, like a prayer no one else could hear. Once dressed and perfumed, the chosen concubine would be escorted through the Golden Road, the narrow hallway that connected the harem to the sultan's private quarters. It twisted like a serpent, deliberately, so that no one could see more than a few steps ahead or behind, always. The mystery, she would arrive at the Hazoda, the imperial bedchamber, where attendants bowed and vanished. Only one remained, the black eunuch, who had guided her here. He would knock gently, announce her, step aside, and then she would enter. The room was lit by oil lamps set in niches. Their glow was soft, golden. Curtains swayed in the breeze from the lattice windows, and the Sultan, whether young or aging, stern or kind, sat waiting, a lion among shadows. Was it love? Sometimes. Sometimes it was formality, a duty. A night recorded in ledgers by scribes, who would never know the quiet laughter or the trembling fingers. The empire, you see, was built on these nights. Every heir, every future, began in whispered darkness. But sometimes, a connection sparked, real and strange, between two people caught in a web of duty, and yet, seen they might talk. About poetry, about dreams, about the way the moonlight fell through the cedar trees near his childhood palace in Manasa, about the silver thread she wove into her sash, a pattern she learned from her grandmother, whose name she no longer spoke aloud. Sometimes, they didn't speak at all, but words weren't always needed, and if, by morning, he smiled gently and said her name again, the new name, or the old, then she might be asked back, and again, until her rooms were moved closer, until other concubines bowed as she passed, until she was no longer just a flower in the garden, but the one chosen to bloom. Yet with favor came danger. Every woman here knew the history of Mahidevran, once beloved, cast into the shadows when Harem rose, of consorts poisoned in their coffee, of sudden exile to the old palace, the Eski Sarai, a place where fallen favorites withered like plucked tulips, out of sight, out of voice. Even affection could be lethal. So alliances were made, not always spoken, but forged in glances over shared tea, in secret hand squeezes during prayers. And behind it all, the eunuchs kept watch, especially one, the chief black eunuch, Kisler, a Kosk. He held the harem's key, literally, a golden key hanging from his waist, unlocking every door, metaphorical and real. He reported directly to the Sultan, or the valid Sultan, depending on who truly held power that week. He was the whisperer of names, the one who knew which girl smiled too often, which concubine wept at night, which servant listened too closely at doors. He was both feared and necessary, and in many ways, the only man inside this empire of women. But let's step outside for a moment, into the harem garden. The sun is rising now, gold lacing across marble. The tulip beds are heavy with dew. Birds circle the domes above, calling to each other. And the girls, those not summoned, not punished, not promoted, stretch and chat, laughing quietly, tossing pebbles into the fountain's mirrored surface. They are young. Many still dream. Some draw verses into the dust with their fingers. Others read old letters from home, now faded and forbidden. One plays the reed flute, her notes trembling like the air before thunder. Another sews tiny pearls into a sash, not for herself, but for her rival. It's tradition, after all. Beauty must be honored, even if it cuts. And within this garden, you feel the strange harmony of rivalry and sisterhood, of perfume and power, of waiting, always, the waiting for a summons, for a glance, for a future that might shimmer or shatter depending on the sultan's mood or his mother's whisper, or the jealousy of a woman whose silence masks fury. Now, let us visit the valid sultan herself. Her chambers are quieter, richer, the carpets thicker, the air dense with incense, amber, oud. Something older. She sits with her women, receiving news. A girl has fallen ill. Another is pregnant. A third has been foolish enough to speak sharply to a visiting dignitary. Her face is unreadable. She nods, makes a mark on her tablet. A name circled once, then twice. That name will vanish soon. No one will say how, but the new girl, the one with the riverstone eyes, and the voice like cracked honey, she is gaining favor. The valid smiles faintly. She will watch that one, maybe, guide her, maybe break her. Depends on the girl's poetry. You see, the harem wasn't just about beauty. It was about elegance, grace, wit, the ability to craft a verse that fluttered into the sultan's ear like a moth, soft but unforgettable. Many girls practiced poetry. Few mastered it. Those who did, they became legends. Their verses recorded in secret books. Their names whispered a century later, long after their bones were dust. And now, the lamps are being lit again. Evening settles over the Bosphorus. The city outside buzzes with merchants, sailors, prayers. But within the harem, the world stills. Women gather in small groups, sipping sherbet, watching shadow plays flicker on silk screens. A storyteller murmurs an old tale about a princess who outwitted a djinn with a single riddle. Laughter ripples. A girl leans back against a cushion and closes her eyes. She knows tonight may be her night, or it may never come, and she is tired of wondering so. She dreams instead of a garden with no walls, of a letter sent freely, in her own name, not one given to her, of a room where love means choice, not duty, but the harem, too. Dreams it dreams. It dreams of sultans not yet born, of alliances not yet forged, of wars that will begin in bedchambers and end in treaties. Because behind every curtain here, history waits, and history is watching so now. As you lie in stillness, the scent of jasmine in your thoughts, and the echo of a reed flute fading from memory. Know this, you have only begun to walk the corridors. Tomorrow we'll meet Harem, the girl who rewrote the rules, the consort who rose to become empress in all but name, and whose love, or cunning, or both, shook an empire to its golden foundations. But tonight, rest. Let the harem hold its breath for you. The shadows will keep your secrets. The silk will remember your name, even the one you no longer speak aloud. You do not wake with a jolt in this palace. You rise slowly, like smoke from a censer, drawn upward by the scent of warm honey bread and murmured prayers from the courtyard. The day has not begun, not properly. It stretches lazily into the morning, like silk unfurling from a spool. Today, someone new is being whispered about. The girls gather near the lattice windows, voices low, pretending to mend robes while their ears remain fixed on the stories drifting in from the corridors. Her name, if it is still hers, is Harem. She arrived with a captured girl from the northern steppes. Red hair like a lantern in the dark, lips quick with laughter, but quicker with words, sharp enough to draw blood. She was not the most beautiful, not in the sculpted sense, but she was strange, and in the harem, strangeness could be a kind of power. She laughed when others wept. She listened when others plotted, and most dangerously she remembered every name, every glance, every kindness, and every slight. They say, She never cried. Not once. Not when she was renamed. Not when her slippers were stolen by jealous hands. Not even when she was struck by a Kalfa for speaking out of turn. Instead, she smiled, and smiled again. And by the time anyone noticed the change, she was seated closer to the Sultan's chamber than the rest. No one knew how many nights she had been summoned. That was the thing about Harem. Her rise was silent, like ink spreading across the page. But the stories spread faster than fire. Some said she sang to him in Russian. Others whispered she brewed him sweet tea laced with poppy syrup. There were rumors of poetry, of laughter that echoed long into the night, of arguments even heated, passionate ones. She did not defer. She did not bow too low. And still, he kept calling her back. He began to forget the others. One by one, the flowers wilted in the shadow of her bloom. The harem shifted, and the valid sultan noticed. You see, Harem was not supposed to stay. That was not how it worked. A concubine could be summoned, favored, even bear a child, but she was never meant to linger. She was to be replaced. That was the rhythm, the design, the system. But Harem ignored the script. She stayed. She bore a son, then another. The Sultan began writing love letters. In his own hand, no one could believe it. Poetry, addressed not to an ideal, but to a woman with real flaws, real fury, real ambition. He called her not just Haseki, his favorite, but Harem. His laughter, that name spread like wildfire. She had rewritten herself, from servant to sovereign, and with every child she birthed, her power deepened. Sons were the currency of the harem. Each boy was a potential heir, each one a chess piece placed closer to the center of the board. But power invited enemies. The old favorites whispered against her. So did court officials. So did foreign ambassadors, who noted with alarm that the Sultan no longer took other khans. It was unnatural, they said. Dangerous. Even the valid Sultan, now aging, began to step carefully, for she knew what Harem had become. Not just a lover, a partner, and yet Harem had not won through seduction. Alone she studied history, languages, law. She wrote letters not only to the Sultan, but to foreign rulers, diplomatic, clever, sharp. She advised on charity works, on palace construction, even on succession matters. A concubine was not meant to do this, but Harem was no longer just a concubine. She had done the unthinkable. She married him, the Sultan. Suleiman himself broke centuries of tradition and took Harem as his legal wife. The court trembled. The old palace stirred in alarm. Every precedent shattered. Every noble line rewritten. A slave girl, now a queen in all but name. The girls in the harem held their breath, and in that breath, the old ways began to die. Let us step now into her chambers. You feel the change instantly. They are no longer tucked away like those of the others. No longer modest. Her rooms gleam with inlaid mother-of-pearl, walls inscribed with verses from the Quran in golden calligraphy. Lamps flicker in jeweled sconces. A delicate scent rises orange blossom and clove. She is not here, not now. But her presence lingers like silk on skin. A chessboard waits on the cushion beside her window, one piece missing, a queen perhaps, or a pawn ascending. There is a letter half-written on her desk, addressed to the Polish king. Harem never forgot where she came from. She wore her origins like armor. Outside her rooms, girls walk with softer steps. No one dares speak her name too loudly, not out of fear, but reverence. She has become mythic, not just in the palace, but across the empire. And yet, she still writes poetry. It is said she wrote verses to her husband, even as he waged war at the edges of the world. In one poem, she writes, "My heart is but a compass, pointing always toward you. Though fate pulls at the tides, I remain inked in devotion." But love, even royal love, does not shelter all. Enemies gathered in secret. They whispered of poison, of ambition, of a woman stepping too far beyond her place. A war brewed not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of Topkapı, and still, she smiled. She learned the names of her enemies' mothers. She sent gifts to their daughters. She whispered advice in her husband's ears softly enough that others never knew whose idea. It truly was. Because Harem did not wield power like a blade. She wore it like perfume, invisible, lingering, undeniable. But there was pain too. She lost one son. Another grew distant, and the others, well, their future was uncertain. In the Ottoman world, only one heir could rule. The others often did not survive. The ascension, she knew what that meant. She had given birth to rivals, and yet she endured, because Harem understood what many did not, that in the world of men, to love and to outlast were both acts of rebellion. Now, night has fallen again. The palace breathes slower. The call to prayer rises over the domes like a silver ribbon. In the harem, girls lie in their beds, whispering stories some remembered, some invented of the red-haired girl who became a queen. They wonder if they will be next, if the sultan will choose them, if their name will be inked in poems or carved in tombs. And somewhere, behind closed doors, Harem pens one last letter, not to her husband, not to her rivals, but to her daughter, because yes, she had daughters too. And while the empire watched the sons, it forgot that women remember longer. Daughters do not inherit thrones, they inherit silence, and sometimes they shatter it. But that is a story for another night. Tonight, as your breath slows and the candle flickers low, know this: the harem was not a cage. Not always. Sometimes it was a stage, and Harem, bright, burning, unforgettable, wrote her story in fire across the silk. Tomorrow, we will follow her daughter, a girl born in the shadow of a woman who dared to dream out loud. A girl raised among whispers and schemes. A girl who would one day look into a mirror and ask, "Am I my mother's heir?" But for now, let your mind drift. The jasmine still clings to the curtains. The flute hums somewhere in the distance, and history wraps around you like a veil, soft and full of secrets. Sleep, the story isn't done yet. Morning returns to Topkapı, not with noise, but with a whisper, a slipper brushing mosaic, a curtain drawn slightly to greet the blue morning, the low murmur of fountains in the garden, still cool with dew. The palace exhales, and beneath its domes, a girl rises. Mihrimah, daughter of Harem, the child born not in shadows, but into the long curling light of legacy. They named her for the sun and the moon combined, Mirstoid, Mamoon, as if they knew from her first cry that she would carry both warmth and weight, and that the eyes of the empire would follow her, whether she chose to be watched or not. She was no ordinary princess, born not to a woman exiled to the shadows, but to one seated beside the sultan, a woman whose laughter changed laws, whose advice shifted wars. And so, Mihrimah did not grow up with dolls and lullabies. She grew up with maps, with silks that came from Damascus, and letters from kings addressed in her mother's name, with whispers that circled her like breeze through latticed marble. She is her mother's mind, and her father's silence. From her earliest years, she watched the harem not as a prisoner, but as an observer. She saw the women who faked tears, and those who wore bruises like medals. She saw the way servants changed their tone when addressing the daughter of a queen, and she learned, long before her first blood, that kindness could be a disguise, and cruelty often wore perfume. By 13, she had memorized every secret path through the palace. By 15, she had learned the sound of power, not loud, not brash, but soft, deliberate, and always just behind a veil. She heard her mother weep once, only once, in a room lit by oil lamps and the sorrow of lost sons. Didn't ask what was wrong. She simply sat beside her mother and held her hand, fingers intertwined like roots beneath the soil. That was the last night her mother ever cried aloud. That was the first night. Mihrimah spoke back to a vizier, and her voice did not shake. The empire watched her grow tall, commanding, with eyes that didn't flicker from contact. She wore her lineage like silk, soft to touch, impossible to tear. But beauty, in the harem, was only ever a beginning. She knew this, knew that soon she would be offered like fruit in a bowl to secure alliances and promises, that her marriage would be less about love and more about borders. And she was right. At 17, the letters began arriving, from pashas, from governors, from noble sons of foreign rulers, even from men twice her age. Enchanted by her reputation before they'd ever seen her face, they called her the Sun Moon Girl. But she was no celestial body to be charted and owned. She listened to each proposal in silence. She allowed the valid sultan to read them aloud. She nodded politely when her father asked if she had preferences, and then she chose not the wealthiest, not the most ambitious, but the most useful. Rustam Pasha, a man with a spine made of law and a heart difficult to read, not a poet, not a warrior, but a tactician. The court was stunned. But Mirama didn't want a mirror. She wanted a shield, and Rustam quiet. Clever Rustam offered exactly that. They were married in spring. The city bloomed in celebration, but the harem watched in silence. They knew better. A princess's wedding was not the beginning of a love story. It was the opening move of a longer game. Mirima didn't cry on her wedding night. She didn't expect roses or vows. She lay beside her husband and asked him which provinces he thought would rebel next. He smiled once and answered together. They became a different kind of couple, not fevered with passion, but bound by understanding. She wrote letters on his behalf, persuasive, sharp, often mistaken for her mother's. She advised him on court disputes, military garrisons, grain shortages. She told him when to remain silent, and when to speak with fire, and soon, whispers began again. She is her mother's daughter. No, she is something more. She bore a daughter, then a son. And though she loved them fiercely, she did not retreat into motherhood. Instead, she built literally MIHRIMAH, commissioned mosques, not 1.2. In Istanbul, her name still echoes in stone. The Mirama Sultan Mosque, a gift to the city that raised her. One placed where the sun sets, the other where it rises, so that on her birthday each year, sunlight and moonlight pass through her mosques at once. A secret design, a quiet legacy, because while others ruled with edicts and armies, she ruled with time. She outlived her brothers, she outlived her mother, and when her father fell into grief, aged and weary, it was Mirama who became his strength. At his bedside she read to him old verses from Persian poets, letters from the front, updates from provinces. When he could no longer see clearly, she described the city to him as if it were still young. When he could no longer speak, she sat with him in silence. And when he died, when Suleiman, the Magnificent, finally closed his eyes, it was Mirama who oversaw the transition, who calmed the palace, who walked the hall her mother once ruled, not as a concubine, nor as a queen, but as a daughter, a bridge between two worlds, between silk and sword. Tonight, the harem sleeps quietly, but in the shadows of its lattice windows. Candles still flicker in chambers that once belonged to her. A robe still hangs in her favorite color, deep plum, embroidered with stars. A letter still rests on her writing table, addressed to her late mother, unsigned. And her voice, it lingers in the stone, in the call to prayer echoing from the mosque, domes in the quiet strength of the women who come after. Because Mirama did not just survive history, she designed it. And now, as night folds over the palace once more, your breath slows. The tiles beneath your feet grow cool, and the scent of jasmine rises again, curling through the corridors, soft as memory. Tomorrow, we will step further, past the reign of women who ruled with beauty and wit, toward one who ruled with blood, a concubine turned shadow queen, who smiled at knives, who loved only once, and lost him in flame. But tonight, sleep. Mirama holds her lantern high, lighting the path for those yet to come. The harem is quiet, but it remembers, and so do you. There are footsteps in the marble halls again, not hurried, not heavy, measured, deliberate, as if the one walking knows the echoes belong to her now. The girl's name was Anastasia once. She spoke Greek, prayed to different gods, and laughed, with the unknowing brightness of a merchant's daughter. But the world shifted beneath her feet like sand. She was taken not with cruelty, not with fire, but with the quiet force of empire, carried across seas, wrapped in foreign silks, renamed Cakesum, and so she stepped into the palace, not with fanfare, but with silence. That was how the clever ones arrived. Not as birds in flight, but as seeds, waiting, watching, rooting themselves deeper. She did not weep, not where anyone could see, in the old palace. She learned obedience. In the new palace, she learned performance, and in the harem, she learned survival. There was beauty, yes, enough to catch a sultan's eye. But it was not beauty alone that saved her. It was the way she listened, how she remembered, how she disappeared when danger brewed, and reappeared when it passed, calm and unbothered. When she was first summoned, she did not tremble. She bathed slowly. She chose no perfume. She spoke little, and the sultan's eye was intrigued. She did not flirt like the others. She asked questions. What did he read? What worried him? She offered no seduction, only presence, and in the echo of his chambers, where so many had offered only softness, Cakesum offered thought. They said he loved her truly, that he built her a private chamber near his own, that he stopped calling others, that her name became a rhythm in his voice. She bore him sons, then more, and with each one, she fastened her place not just in the harem but in history. But love alone does not sustain power. Empires do not run on affection. They run on heirs, on death, on timing. When Ahmed died young, the palace trembled. The air went cold. The corridors turned sharp again, but Cakesum endured. She had sons, and sons meant leverage. The throne passed to another, for a time her stepson. She waited, she smiled, and when her own son, Murad IV, rose to power, Cakesum did not retreat behind. The curtain, she stepped through it. A mother, yes, but more, a regent. She sat behind the divan, veiled but commanding. She whispered policies, she approved appointments, and soon, the empire understood. This was no mere mother. This was a queen, in all but name. Her sons ruled, but her voice ruled them. And when Murad grew cruel, drinking deep, punishing fiercely, it was Cakesum who softened his edges when she could, who pleaded for mercy, who buried the ones she couldn't save. It broke her, but not enough to stop, and when he died suddenly, his brother, her other son, took the throne. Again, Cakesum ruled behind the veil, again. The empire bent to a voice it never quite heard aloud, but power, like silk. Phrays. Her enemies multiplied. They feared her influence, envied it, plotted in corners. They sent whispers through the palace. Like poison, she decides too much. She speaks for the sultan. She is not a woman. She is a shadow with teeth. And perhaps they were right, because Cakesum had survived 3 reigns. She had advised, maneuvered, removed rivals with words, and sometimes more. She knew where the letters were hidden. She knew who listened at which door. She rewarded loyalty with gold. She punished betrayal without raising her voice. And yet, she was still a woman, still veiled, still vulnerable. When her son died and her grandson took the throne, she remained regent once more. But her grip was slipping. The valid sultan is only powerful if her son listens. And young men grow deaf with age, especially when others whisper in their ears. Cakesum's final days unfolded like a silent play. The new queen, Turhant, her daughter-in-law rose, a rival, younger, smiling with the same serenity Cakesum once wore. But beneath its steel, saw what Cakesum had done, and she would not let the same fate befall her. The palace divided, 2 queens, 1 empire. 1 veil, 1 throne. It ended not with a duel but a door, a locked chamber, a silken cord. They found Cakesum days later, strangled in her own rooms, by those she once commanded. No screams, no blood, just the soft hush of silk pulled tight. History records it politely. She passed in the year of the lion, but the harem remembers it, remembers the girl who arrived as a captive, who became a queen, who held empires in her palm and sons in her heart, and who fell to the same silence she once mastered. Tonight, the corridors still whisper her name, Cakesum, the mother of kings, the architect of shadows. She walks the palace still, not in spirit, but in memory. Her initials carved behind a mirror, her mosque still rising above the Bosphorus, and in the harem, where young girls still gather behind latticed windows. They speak her name only once, softly, because power may pass, but presence true. Presence never vanishes. Tonight, you lie beneath that same moon, the fountains murmur, the lamps flicker, and the air is thick with memory. Tomorrow, we will walk deeper still, toward the final veil, toward a woman who turned survival into strategy and betrayal into legacy. She was not born in the palace. She was sent there, trained, sharpened. She arrived not as a flower, but as a blade, and when she bloomed, even sultans bent their heads. But that is for another night. Tonight, rest. Cakesum has told her story, not in screams, but in soft, remembered silence. Let it settle around you now, like a veil or a throne. The footsteps that echo now are smaller, lighter, yet they carry weight, more than iron chains, more than royal decrees. They belong to a girl who has yet to know her name, will one day be written in gold and in shadow. Her name will rise on mosque domes and sink beneath cold marble floors. She will dance with power, kiss the lips of emperors, and step through the ashes of queens who thought themselves eternal. Her name is not yet spoken aloud, not by the harem gatekeepers, not by the women who polish brass trays, not even by the chambermaids who weave her hair. She is simply the girl from the steppes, the one with snowflaked eyes. They call her Rabia now, or Hatias, or Ache. She answers to them all, for in the palace, names are as shifting as the tides of the Bosphorus. Her old name was abandoned, at the harem gate, her old language stolen by the hush of Turkish lullabies, but her memory, remains sharp. She remembers the horse that grazed outside her father's tent, the smell of pine, needles after rain, the sound of her mother's voice singing to the moon, calling upon forgotten gods. Now her world smells of jasmine and old incense. Her world tastes of sugared figs and soft flatbread. Her world is bound by walls so high that only the sky dares trespass. Yet the girl is patient. The palace is a place where impatience withers like untended roses. She watches the older concubines sharpen their smiles. She listens to eunuchs deliver rumors wrapped in half-truths. She memorizes every turn of the corridors, every whispered story about queens who came before. She learns, and the harem learns her in return. They notice the stillness in her eyes, too old for her tender years. They notice how she listens more than she speaks, how she smooths the fabric of her robe without thought, how her lips curve only when she chooses. And in the private chambers of the palace, the valid sultan begins to inquire. The sultan needs new blossoms, fresh and untamed. A steppes girl is summoned. Rabia bathes in milk, her hair perfumed, her skin brushed until it gleams like polished ivory. She is dressed in the softest silks, taken through doors most women never see, into the grand expanse where the sultan himself reclines under domes that swallow sound and magnify power. Her fate is sealed, not with violence, not with terror, but with the slow, intoxicating weight of attention. The sultan speaks. She answers, not like a peasant, not like a cornered dough, but like someone who remembers freedom and chooses captivity. That night, the harem shifts around her. The women who had smiled grow distant. The chambermaids, who had whispered, now bow deeper. Eunuchs begin to glance away, unwilling to meet her eyes. She is no longer one of many. She is chosen, favored, and the harem, like the river, changes its course. With each visit to the sultan's chambers, Rabia peels away the fear, discards the meekness, and uncurls the power stitched inside her ribs. By the time her first child is born, she has learned that survival in the palace is not about obedience, it is about timing. She is called Mopikar now, moon-faced. Her laughter is softer, her gaze heavier, her words wrapped in honey but sharpened beneath. She doesn't waste her days embroidering cloth. For festivals she'll never attend. She listens behind silk partitions, learns the names of viziers, memorizes the rivalries that ferment within the palace walls. And when the sultan dies, suddenly, violently, beneath the suffocating weight of palace intrigues, Mopikar does not weep long. Her son is young, too young for the throne, but age is not the only crown in the empire. A mother's voice can rule when a boy cannot. and Mopikar becomes Cakesum. Sultan. The name settles on the palace like a storm cloud. Soft, unyielding, endless. Her enemies rise like weeds. Viziers plot, rivals sharpen their tongues. The court bristles beneath her growing shadow. They speak of her as a foreigner, a slave girl, a concubine who dared to step where only sultans tread. But Cakesum does not flinch. She governs with a hand both open and closed. To her allies, she is generous. She restores provinces, gifts, land, appoints governors who owe her everything. To her enemies, she is quiet, and silence, they learn, is the most terrifying sound of all. In the golden chambers of Topkapı, she receives emissaries from distant lands. Her veil hides her face, but her words travel freely. Her decisions ripple across continents. Wars are waged and avoided at her soft command. She oversees the harem as a lioness does her den. Young girls tremble beneath her stare. And yet, in their dreams they yearn to be like her. She watches as sons grow and die, as new sultans rise on the back of old betrayals. Through it all, Cakesum remains, like the palace itself. But time is a thief, even the most cunning cannot outwit. The palace that once adored her now fears her. Her grandchildren, raised beneath her shadow, begin to pull at the threads she had so carefully woven. The corridors become colder. The eunuchs grow silent, and one night, in a chamber gilded with the riches of half the world, Cakesum understands her end has come, not through sword, not through exile, but through the soft kiss of betrayal. Her final breaths are taken, beneath the same domes where she once ruled. Her final vision not of victory, but of inevitable silence. History carves her name deeply into stone. Cakesum Sultan, the girl who rose from the steps, who wore chains before she wore crowns, who loved deeply and ruled fiercely. Her shadow never left the palace. Even centuries later, her story clings to the marble. But the harem moves on, because empires, like gardens, prune their most beautiful flowers. And tonight, we step beyond her fall, toward the twilight of the harem itself, toward a time when the world presses closer, when the empire groans under its own splendor, when the whispers of European powers seep through the palace walls like dampness. The harem changes its colors. No longer just a cradle of future sultans. It becomes a theater, a battleground of influence. And within its shifting shadows, another figure emerges. This one, not born of captivity, but of purpose, sent not as a prize, but as a player, trained in the art of seduction, refined in the craft of manipulation. A woman chosen by foreign hands to slip into the heart of the Ottoman court and pull its strings from within. Her name will not be whispered with reverence. It will be spoken with awe, with fear, with grudging respect, because the next tale belongs not to a princess, nor a mother, nor a slave, but to a spy, a jewel of deception, an enigma who danced between loyalty and betrayal, love and duty, east and west. But for tonight, sleep. Let the sound of distant waves soothe your thoughts. Let the softness of woven silks cradle you. The harem doors close gently, but behind them, the story waits, the tale unfolds, and you are part of it now. The doors of the harem had closed around the past, but within those walls, history was never truly buried. It breathed in the marble, whispered through latticed windows, and rested in the silk cushions pressed beneath jeweled bodies. And now, beyond the reign of queens, beyond the glory days of Cakesum, the palace awaited something new. Not a consort who rose from chains, not a mother who ruled through sons, but a shadow cloaked in silk, a woman sent not from the steppes, but across the blue waters of the Mediterranean. Her footsteps did not tremble through the tiled courtyards. They glided. She arrived with a purpose, shaped by hands distant from the palace, yet determined to carve their influence within it. Her name, upon arrival, was unfamiliar to the Ottomans.Roxelana, not the Roxelana of old, not the beloved wife of Suleiman, the magnificent who had rewritten the rules centuries before. This was a different kind of Roxelana, not born of romance, but of strategy. She was trained not only in the gentle arts of the harem, but in the subtle weapons of diplomacy. Her voice was laced with multiple languages, her eyes sharpened by observation, her smile curved by ambition. Behind her arrival, there were whispers of envoys who paid too much for a single woman, of letters exchanged between embassies, of secrets carried by sea captains under the guise of trade. No one truly knew who sent her. Some murmured Vienna, others swore by Venetian plots, and some suspected the long fingers of Parisian salons. But the truth, like the most dangerous currents, remained hidden beneath the surface. She was placed not among the lowly concubines, but in the circle of favored learners. Her chambers, though modest, overlooked the inner gardens where the Sultan's most trusted walked at sunset. She studied the prayers, the etiquette of courtly life, the traditions of the empire. But she did not forget herself, in the privacy of her chamber, beneath the sacred tiles and beneath the heavy gaze of eunuchs. She remembered the purpose stitched into her every breath: to get close, to listen, to influence, and in time, to change the course of a dynasty. But the palace was no fool's playground. It had swallowed and spat out many like her, ambitious, beautiful, and naive. Roxolana knew patience was her true currency. For months, she remained unseen, a quiet ripple in the greater pond of the harem. She bowed where needed. She smiled when expected. She wove silk with nimble fingers, embroidered verses in languages only she understood, and danced when summoned, not like a girl of submission, but like a woman who owned every step. And slowly, her name began to rise, not in the grand halls of the viziers, nor in the divans where laws were carved, but in the inner palace, among the confidants of the Sultan, among the women who whispered closest to his ear. She became known as Roxolana, the Black Roxolana, not for the color of her skin, but for the secrets that seemed to pool in her gaze like endless night. Her first encounter with the Sultan came not during a feast or a grand celebration, but in the quiet hours of a spring afternoon. He was walking through the rose gardens, heavy with thought, burdened by the weight of wars that stretched too long and alliances that crumbled too easily. She was placed in his path, not by accident, but by design. Her steps were measured, her eyes lowered, but not completely. Her voice, when she greeted him, carried not fear, but music, in a palace filled with rehearsed flattery. The Sultan paused. He asked her name. She answered, Roxolana, letting it linger in the air, like a forbidden perfume. The Sultan's curiosity was stirred within days. She was summoned not to his grand chamber, but to the smaller pavilion by the Golden Horn, a place reserved for conversations, for laughter, for respite from the Iron Crown. Their exchanges began lightly: poetry, stories of distant lands, curious inquiries about European customs. But Roxolana was trained well. She did not reveal more than she intended. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was with layers, with subtlety, with the mastery of someone who understood that the mind, not the body, was the true battlefield. The Sultan, a man weary of deceit, accustomed to the ornate falsehoods of the court, found himself intrigued. She spoke of tides, of stars, of the delicate balance between destiny and choice, and with every meeting, the invisible thread between them tightened. But power in the palace was a many-headed serpent. Other concubines noticed old alliances stirred. The valid Sultan, though aged, was no fool. She summoned Roxolana one evening, veiled and distant, her voice carrying the cold authority of decades. "Where do your loyalties lie, child?" she asked, her words coated with both warning and curiosity. Seated before her, met her gaze without flinching. "My loyalty is to the Sultan's peace," she replied softly, knowing full well that in the empire, peace was the rarest, most desirable illusion. The valid Sultan studied her, her fingers tapping against a carved ivory cane, before waving her away. For a time, the palace held its breath, but Roxolana did not falter. She moved with grace, with humility, with the air of a woman who knew when to be invisible and when to shine. Within a year, her influence blossomed. She was given her own attendants, her robes, adorned with richer embroidery, her presence requested not just by the Sultan, but by his closest advisors. In private moments, Roxolana spoke of distant alliances, of merchant routes that could be secured, of enemies who could be softened with gifts rather than swords. She introduced the Sultan to the forgotten wisdom of books brought from Andalusia, shared tales of inventions whispered about in Italian courts, spoke of treaties crafted with not just ink but with understanding. And the Sultan listened, for in her he found not just companionship, but counsel. Yet the walls of Topkapı were not built for foreign dreams. As Roxolana's star rose, so did the tide of resentment. Whispers grew, sharper, accusations whispered in the ears of old viziers. Some said she practiced foreign magic, that her food carried poisons from distant apothecaries, that her touch was laced with sorcery. Others claimed she sought to overturn the sacred customs, to lead the Sultan astray, to weaken the sword arm of the empire. In the Grand Divan tempers flared the janissaries, restless after years of delayed wages and neglected victories. Grumbled louder, the valid Sultan, sensing the fragile balance, moved to curtail Roxolana's reach. Orders were given, spies placed, letters intercepted, but Roxolana anticipated. With every challenge she adapted, with every rumor she crafted a counter-narrative. She aligned herself with rising viziers, supported causes that softened the hearts of the common folk, ensured that the coffers were filled through. Trade agreements whispered into the Sultan's ear during twilight hours. She was not merely surviving, she was thriving yet. Deep within her chambers, amidst the silks and perfumes, Roxolana understood her time was borrowed. The empire, vast and unruly, would never allow a foreign flower to root too deeply. Her letters, hidden in secret compartments, continued to flow, to Venice, to Vienna, to perhaps even distant Paris. Her reports spoke not of romance, but of power dynamics, of shifting alliances, of weaknesses to be exploited, and strengths to be respected. She was, above all else, a student of the empire, and the empire was a volatile teacher. Years passed. Wars came and went. Sultans grew weary. The harem shifted, as it always did, and Roxolana, though no longer as fresh-faced as the younger concubines who arrived each spring, retained her hold, not through beauty, not through seduction, but through relevance. Her chamber became a hub for petitions. Her opinions echoed in decisions that shaped borders. She was consulted on matters of charity, on the rebuilding of mosques, on the appointments of key officials. She stood, veiled but unbowed, amidst the swirling currents of imperial politics. Yet nothing in the palace was eternal. Her enemies, though temporarily subdued, never vanished. When the Sultan fell ill, the air turned thick with anticipation. Factions sharpened their blades, both literal and metaphorical. The question that lingered in every corridor, beneath every breath, was simple. Would Roxolana survive the turning of the tide, or would she, like so many before, be discarded, her body left to rest in unmarked silence? But Roxolana prepared in her final days of influence. She secured futures not just for herself, but for those who had remained loyal. She arranged marriages, forged alliances, buried secrets in vaults only she knew. When the Sultan's breath finally left his body, when the call to prayer mourned not just a man but an era, Roxolana stood at her balcony, watching the golden horn shimmer beneath a crimson sun. She did not weep. She did not falter. History does not clearly record her end. Some say she was quietly retired to the old palace, her days spent in quiet reflection. Others whisper she returned to her homeland, her mission completed, her pockets heavy with gold and knowledge, and a precious few, believe she vanished entirely, slipping back into the currents of diplomacy, her identity shifting once more, becoming yet another shadow in the great game of empires. But within the harem, her story remained, told in hushed tones, in the flicker of oil lamps, in the soft rustle of veils, not as a love story, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson that power wears. Many faces that silence can be sharper than swords, that within the deepest confines of gilded cages, freedom can be carved, if one dares enough. Tonight, the palace slumbers. The fountains murmur ancient secrets. The walls cradle the weight of forgotten names. And you, You have walked these corridors, felt the silk beneath your fingers, listened to the whispered legacies of women who lived, loved, ruled, and sometimes outlasted empires. Tomorrow, we step further into the harem's final tales, toward rebellion, toward revolution, toward the inevitable crumbling of the walls that held so much for too long. But now, rest. Let your breath slow, let your thoughts drift. The night guards the palace, and the palace guards its stories, and here, within its embrace, you are safe, for now. With the quiet departure of Roxolana, the walls of the harem grew heavier, not because of sorrow, not because of loss, but because of anticipation. For every silence within Topkapı was simply a pause before the next storm. Seasons turned, sultans rose, some with grand visions, others with fragile hearts. But the empire, vast and aging, began to show cracks that no perfumed concubine nor silver-tongued vizier could mend. It began subtly, like a distant echo carried on the Bosphorus wind. Merchants whispered of foreign ships with strange flags docking in the harbors. Scholars spoke of strange ideas crossing borders, philosophies of liberty, of nations ruled not by blood, but by the will of the many. And within the harem, where the outer world was always kept at a calculated distance, these whispers seeped through, not through the eunuchs, whose tongues were tied by duty, not through the viziers, whose paths never crossed the perfumed halls, but through the odalisks, the lesser-ranked women, the dancers who sometimes performed before visiting ambassadors, the laundry girls who listened at the edges of foreign quarters. Bit by bit, the stories arrived, tales of Europe ablaze, of kings losing their heads in public squares, of commoners wielding power that once belonged only to the gilded, and amidst the cushions and the embroidered silks, a new awareness stirred the Ottoman Empire. Proud and ancient, was not immune to the tides of change. Within the harem, a generation of women had grown watching the slow erosion of the Sultan's authority. They had seen the janissaries once, fierce defenders of the throne, descend into corrupt mobs, demanding coin over duty. They had watched the palace coffers shrink, the grandeur of feasts dulling, the once mighty armies struggling to claim distant victories. They had listened as the older women, their hair streaked with silver, spoke of the days when a single glance from a favorite could alter the fate of kingdoms. But now, glances were ignored, poems unread, and power seemed to slip through the fingers of the court like water through cracked marble. Among these women was Daria, not a spy, not a queen, not a pawn sent by foreign powers, but a daughter of Anatolia. Born in a quiet fishing village, sold into servitude during one of the many raids that pockmarked the collapsing frontiers. Daria had no letters stitched from embassies, no training in seduction, no mastery of political intrigue. What she had was sharper memory. She remembered the smell of salt on her skin, the weight of simple freedom, the laughter of brothers before they were swallowed by conscription. She did not rise through games of affection, but through wit. She learned swiftly, faster than the tutors could predict, with a hunger that startled even the seasoned matrons of the harem. She mastered languages, absorbed history, memorized not just verses of love, but of law, of trade, of treaties, and slowly, like water carving stone, she climbed not to the sultan's side, for by then the sultans themselves had become prisoners of ceremony, men of seclusion and paranoia, trapped within the ritualized cages their ancestors had built. No, Daria rose through influence over those who truly ran the palace, the stewards, the secretaries, the money counters, and, most crucially, the mother of the sultan. By the time she reached her 20th winter, Daria sat in chambers where decisions were whispered, where the future of provinces was debated, not with armies, but with alliances of coin and cunning. And in those secret councils, she heard of the winds gathering beyond the empire's borders, of Russians pressing south, hungry for warm ports, of Austrians plotting with every border governor, waiting for the first crack to widen, of revolutionaries sprouting in the Balkans, sharpening blades beneath church altars, dreaming of freedom within the harem. Others laughed at such tales. This palace has stood for centuries, they would say, lounging beneath painted ceilings. But Daria felt the foundation tremble, and she was not alone. among the younger circle. A quiet resistance formed, not against the Sultan, but against the decay. Women who had been taught to only please began to study. They dissected foreign customs, learned the maps of the empire better than many generals, charted the rise and fall of nations beyond their shores. In hidden corners, they spoke of reform, of awakening the empire before it was too late, and Daria became their voice. When officials came to the harem seeking funds for fruitless wars, it was Daria who questioned them. When merchants sought trade privileges that would bleed the provinces, it was Daria who countered with knowledge of better terms, better partners. Her reputation grew not as a consort, but as a mind sharper than many viziers. As a whisper the Grand Vizier himself had to respect, but respect in the court was fragile for every admirer. Daria gained enemies, men whose fortunes relied on the slow death of the empire, on the blind indulgences of a disconnected court. They called her the fisherman's curse, a woman who dared to muddy the sacred waters of tradition. Yet, in the harem, she became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of awakening, and beyond the palace, in the sprawling city of Istanbul. The air grew tenser, riots flared, red lines stretched, and the Sultan's face became a rare sight. Hidden behind more layers of protocol, the janissaries grumbled, the ulama debated, and foreign cannons began to appear across the empire's fragile borders. And within the palace walls, Daria faced her greatest trial. An edict was issued, one that would sell the empire's last reserves to foreign banks, binding the Sultan to European debtors. The valid Sultan hesitated. The Grand Vizier pressed forward, and in that moment, Daria stepped into forbidden ground, in a secret council held under the domes of the imperial mosque. She spoke not as a concubine, not as a woman of pleasure, but as a guardian of the empire's fading soul. Her words cut through the room. Like northern wind, she spoke of the dangers of dependency, of the loss of sovereignty, of the future where the Ottoman name would become a puppet strung by foreign hands. She invoked history, calling upon the memories of sultans who expanded the empire not with treaties of servitude, but with dignity. The room trembled. The valid Sultan, herself old and weary, withdrew her blessing from the edict. The Grand Vizier fumed, but tradition bound him to the decisions within that sacred circle. The foreign banks were forced to renegotiate. The terms softened, the bleeding slowed. For a moment, Daria became a legend within the walls of the palace, a woman who saved an empire, if only for a little longer. But empires do not crumble in a single stroke. They wither, fracture, and fade, piece by piece. The moment of victory gave way to newer challenges, more rebellions, more betrayals, and eventually, the endless European meddling returned, stronger, more invasive. Daria, now older, saw the inevitable. She had slowed the decay, but she could not halt time. And as the final days of the Ottoman harem approached, the palace became quieter, no longer filled with the laughter of ambitious courtesans, or the schemes of rising favorites. The younger women arrived with eyes already dulled, knowing they were entering a relic, not a kingdom of dreams. Daria watched as reforms swept through the empire, as the very walls of Topkapı lost their sacred grip, as the city's heartbeat moved to newer palaces along the Bosphorus, more European in design, more modern in function. The old harem, once the heart of power, became a museum of forgotten glories. And in her final days, Daria walked through the silent corridors, fingers brushing against the worn mosaics, eyes lingering on the fading murals of women who had danced, loved, ruled, and resisted. She smiled, not in defeat, but in understanding. Empires rise, empires fall, but within their greatest prisons, the human spirit always found ways to whisper, to fight, to matter. On a quiet spring morning, Daria took her last walk to the balcony overlooking the Golden Horn. The city bustled below, unaware of the woman who had once bent the palace currents. She exhaled slowly, feeling the wind kiss her cheeks one final time, and in that moment, she was not a concubine, not a savior, not a relic, but simply Daria, a daughter of the sea, a witness to history. As the muezzin's call echoed across domes and minarets, Daria closed her eyes, the weight of centuries humming beneath her feet. And so, The harem's last whisper faded into the wind, carrying tales not of chains, nor merely of pleasure, but of women who dreamed, who fought, who dared to rewrite their fates, even within gilded cages. The morning broke without ceremony, the old palace basking in a quiet it had never known. The Bosphorus shimmered beneath a softer sun, and the echoes of power within Topkapı faded into distant memory. Years passed since Daria's final walk. Upon the balcony, the harem, once a world unto itself, became something else entirely, a hushed relic of an age, whose bones still stood but whose soul had drifted away. The empire itself staggered, its weight too great for even the strongest. Pillars, new sultans took the throne, each one thinner in authority than the last. Where once the sultan's word cut across continents, now it struggled to reach beyond the palace walls. The court shifted to Topkapı Palace. With grand European chandeliers, mirrored halls, and carved ceilings borrowed from Parisian architects, it stood proud along the Bosphorus shore. But those within knew, it was not strength they were imitating, it was survival. Topkapı remained, no longer as a seat of power, but as a shadow of the empire's golden age. The harem itself became a prison of silence. The laughter of concubines, the scheming whispers of favorites, and the measured steps of eunuchs gave way to tour guides, rehearsing scripts for curious foreign eyes. Rooms, where alliances were forged and fates decided, became exhibition halls. The imperial gardens, once walked by women clothed in dreams and ambition, hosted picnics for visiting dignitaries, and the chambers of Daria, once a sanctuary of awakening, were sealed behind glass. Her name forgotten, her influence erased from the carefully curated narratives. The new empire, now desperate to impress the West, wished to forget the power women once held, to cleanse its image of harems and sensuality, replacing it with factories, parliament halls, and imported fashion. But history is stubborn. Even as Topkapı's stones remained silent, their surfaces held memories of power whispered, of love bargained, of revolutions imagined in the quiet of embroidered pillows. Outside, Istanbul transformed. The cobbled streets gave way to tram lines. The call to prayer now competed with the shrill whistles of steamboats. The janissaries were no more, long ago disbanded, replaced by a modern army drilled by European officers, armed with rifles instead of sabers. But modernity did not come cleanly. Each reform cut deeper into the empire's flesh, and every concession to foreign powers drained its spirit. In distant corners of the empire, provinces began to slip away, like loosened threads from a once immense tapestry. The Balkans ignited first, then Arabia, burned with rebellion. The African provinces vanished under European banners, and through it all, Istanbul watched once the beating heart of an unstoppable world, now a patient bleeding from 1,000 unseen wounds. Inside the shrinking court, a boy was born. His name was Mehmed, the last in a line of sultans who had inherited both unimaginable luxury and an empire teetering on collapse. He grew beneath ceilings, painted with triumphs of ancestors he would never match. He dined beneath portraits of conquerors whose ambitions he could not replicate. And as his ministers bickered and his provinces rebelled, Mehmed turned to the past for comfort. He walked through the old harem halls, now silent as tombs, feeling the pulse of bygone centuries beneath his footsteps. In the Hall of Favorites, he paused. Longest no longer forbidden, no longer sacred, the chamber stood frozen in time, its silks fraying, its tapestries dulled by years of neglect. There was no Daria to advise him, no Roxolana to strategize, no Harem to command, just echoes. He placed a palm against the cold marble and whispered to no one, "What are we, if not stories waiting to be forgotten?" His reign was brief. The First World War stormed through the empire like a hurricane, dismantling what centuries had built. Alliances were betrayed, promises broken, and when the guns fell silent, the once mighty Ottoman Empire was reduced to a ghost, its territory swallowed by victors with maps and pens sharper than swords. The Sultanate, once the sacred embodiment of faith and empire, was abolished. The caliphate followed, and with it, the harem, its rituals, its codes, its unseen politics, became history, not through gradual fade, but through decree. The palace doors opened, not for grand viziers or warriors, but for scholars, cataloging artifacts, for artists sketching remnants of forgotten grandeur. The women of the harem were freed, but not celebrated. Some married quietly, some vanished into anonymity. Others, too aged to adapt to the outside world, remained in Istanbul, relics of a bygone order. Daria's name never returned to the lips of the historians. No statue commemorated the fisherman's daughter, who had once defied an empire's decline. But the halls where she walked, the cushions where she listened, the gardens where she plotted, they remembered in the final years of the old palace. Amidst the foreign tourists and the clicking cameras, a young guide named Layla began her work. Her voice, clear and rhythmic, wove the forgotten tales back into life. She spoke not just of sultans, but of the women who shaped the empire from within. She told of the scheming favorites, of the poets cloaked in silks, of the quiet revolutions that began behind embroidered screens. And every time she passed the chamber where Daria had once breathed her last, she lingered, tracing the wall's faded patterns. No official record told of Derya, no guidebook mentioned her name, but Layla felt the weight of her presence at night. After the gates of Topkapı closed, Layla walked those empty halls, her footsteps the only sound, and whispered to the ancient stones, "You are not forgotten." Because in the end, that was the true legacy of the harem. Not simply a tale of submission, not merely a theater of desire, but a sanctuary where forgotten voices carved their place in eternity. Empires rise and fall, kingdoms crumble, but the whispers within walls, the breaths held between intrigue and ambition, they linger far longer than crowns and banners. As the modern Republic of Turkey marched forward, as skyscrapers replaced minarets, and bustling boulevards swallowed the narrow lanes of the old city, Topkapı remained, no longer a palace, but a memory, no longer a seat of power, but a reminder. And when Layla stood at the gates at dusk, watching the sun set over the Bosphorus, she smiled quietly. The world had moved on, but behind the harem doors, beneath layers of history, the whispers of those forgotten women, their loves, their schemes, their dreams, still danced in the air, eternal and unbowed. The night falls once more, Istanbul's lights flicker, and the palace dreams, not of what it was, but of the stories that will forever echo within its ancient walls.